Welcome, Left Reckoners, to a Sunday show. No David this week, but I'm joined by ArunAnnow. He is a South Asian politics understander on YouTube and Twitch, the biggest streamer on Twitch, which is, I'm glad to hear that Asmon Gold has been unseated. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I appreciate it.
It's well earned. We're talking about India and Pakistan, and for folks who didn't follow the past couple of weeks, we can update you on the basics here, and I'm curious what your read is on this. This is a rather, I think, detached, almost as if it's looking at a basketball game, a breakdown from the Financial Times, but it says India and Pakistan are both claiming victory in the short, sharp confrontation that brought the nuclear-armed neighbors to the brink of war. Analysts say the U.S. intervention that led to the ceasefire gave Islamabad the diplomatic upper hand by using missile-strike air bases and alleged terrorist infrastructure deep inside Pakistan. Indian officials say they established a deterrent to anyone involved in any involvement by Islamabad in cross-border terrorism. And Pakistan, which claims to have shot down 5 Indian fighters last week, insisted scored a historic victory over its larger rival in the conflict. In a first, both sides sent drones deep into each other's cities. Do you think that's a fair representation of what happened?
I mean, yeah, both sides are claiming victory. It's a lot of what's going on has been hearsay on both sides. It's very hard to get an actual read on what has actually been happening. There's a lot of fog of war information, information fog of war, where it was basically, when we were actually covering it, we actually had to rely on basically outside sources to really get an understanding of what was happening. Because unfortunately, as the escalations were happening, both India and Pakistan were engaging in outrageous lies, and they were just, straight posting stuff online. They're posting faster than people could verify. A great example is especially the Indian media. So I'll give you an example of the Indian media. I think in the second day of escalations, the Indian mainstream media was basically claiming that the Indian army was bombing the port of Karachi, which is Karachi is the largest city in Pakistan at the moment. It's kind of like their Mumbai in a sense. So Karachi so they were saying the Indian army has now just assaulted the port of Karachi. They were taking over Quetta and Peshawar, which is even further west, closer onto the border with Iran and Afghanistan. So they were engaging in the Indian mainstream media was engaging in outrageous lies. And for the Pakistani side, they were basically saying that one of the major Pakistani accounts, I think it was the government of Pakistan, or I don't remember which handle it was, but they posted Arma 3 video game footage as attacks on Indian soil or Indian bases. So there was a decent amount of there was a lot of, I guess, information just being pummeled, that pushed out rapidly, So it's very hard to say who actually. I mean, we know who lost. The average person in both India and Pakistan has lost, and we know who lost even more than the average person in India and Pakistan. It's Kashmiris. Kashmiris are the biggest losers in this entire thing because Kashmiris are under occupation by both Pakistan and India. So, and despite, India is at least brazenly honest about their open. At least right-wing nationalists in India are openly honest about their hatred of Kashmiris, whereas Pakistan on the other hand, the Pakistani state, talks a big game about, Kashmiri rights and Kashmiri independence, but the truth of the matter is they're also subjecting the Kashmiris to, enforced disappearances, and they're effectively using the Kashmiri people as human meat shields against India. So the Kashmiris are the biggest losers in this entire thing, and unfortunately, there were lots of civilian casualties in Kashmir, in both Pakistan side and India side.
And can you just contextualize? So this starts off with an attack on tourists in Kashmir. Folks may have heard Kashmir, but just what is the political status, and how did Kashmir come to be sort of in this no man's land?
So Kashmir is a really diverse general geographic region that is basically controlled by 3 entities: Pakistan, India, and China. And it's a very diverse region. So you can broadly divide it into multiple different divisions. Pakistan controls some of it, and these are the provinces of Gilgit-Baltistan and what they call Azad or Free Jammu and Kashmir. And India controls Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu and Kashmir are actually now different divisions in J&K, and they also control another territory called Ladakh. And this is in the far north portions of both countries, of both India and Pakistan. And if you've ever seen like Google Maps, you'll see like the weird dotted lines if you go a little further north on India and Pakistan. That's Kashmir. It's not accurate to say it's disputed between Pakistan and India, if we're really going to be honest here. The truth is both Pakistan and India are committing atrocities against Kashmiris. It's just that India is worse than Pakistan on this. Right, India is far worse when it comes to their treatment of the Kashmiris than Pakistan is by far. So it's a territory that is under military surveillance by both Pakistan and especially India. Kashmir is the most militarized zone in the world. I think there's roughly 700,000 Indian military personnel in Kashmir alone. And the way Kashmir got to where it is right now, and I'm going to summarize an entire bunch of history. So Kashmiris were actually under the rule of several different dynasties. It was the Mughal dynasty, then the Sikh Empire got control of them, and then what happened was the British actually got control of the Kashmir region, and they had control of the Kashmiri people. But what they actually did is they sold the Kashmiris to a princely state called the Dogra dynasty, led by the Singh family, and the last member of that family is called Hari Singh. So they sold basically Kashmiris as nearly slaves to the Dogra dynasty. And so what happened was once partition happened, once the states of India and Pakistan were formed, Kashmir, most of the princely states that existed in both India and Pakistan, which were basically like feudal, tributaries of the British Empire. They were vassal states of the British Empire. They, one way or another, got ceded into either Pakistan or India. Kashmir was the only exception, right? Because Kashmir was kind of straddling the border between the two, right? What happened was eventually, Kashmiris never had a say in where they were headed anyways. But eventually what happened was Hari Singh wanted to stay neutral, and because of this, so this was preceded by an ethnic cleansing that Hari Singh actually did of the Jammu region of its Muslim population. So Hari Singh actually did an ethnic cleansing of the Muslims of Jammu, which then led to a backlash from Pakistan, and Pakistan actually sent a bunch of militants over the border to basically, try and basically claim Kashmir for themselves. And this basically made Hari Singh sign the instrument of accession to join India. So that's how basically Kashmir gets to where it is right now. In the wake of partition, it's basically automatically partitioned between it's basically been split between Pakistan and India. And China actually claims a portion of it as well. And then later on, portions of Pakistan administered Kashmir was given to, or POK, Pakistan occupied Kashmir was given to China. It's the Shaksgam Valley. So this is I don't like saying it's a disputed region because the people that it really belongs to are the native people of that region. I don't think this region belongs to either Pakistan or India. I think the people living in that region should get to decide. But that's basically the history of Kashmir in a nutshell, as quickly as I can give it. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's, I'm very interested in your commentary on that and sort of partition in general as the types of deals that Britain cut with different groups to basically, as their empire was unraveling.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, Pakistan and India were inventions in part by Britain and the people that they could, work with there. Is that basically a good gloss on it?
So Pakistan and India. So Pakistan is basically kind of the brainchild of the Muslim League. So Pakistan is, so there's a thing called the two-nation theory, which was originally posited, ironically enough, not by the Muslim League. It was actually done by Hindu nationalists. It was actually originally promulgated by Hindu nationalists, or the proto-Hindu nationalists, the predecessors of the RSS, right? So the two-nation theory is this concept where Hindus and Muslims and we'll get to why the concept of Hindus is already problematic to begin with. But there are two groups of there are ultimately two nations in the British Raj, Hindus and Muslims, that cannot live together, that ultimately cannot ever live together. The Muslim League's interpretation of this was that, if those Muslims, if we as Muslims were to reside in a Hindu majority India, then we would be persecuted, right? So that's the idea of their interpretation of that. So we as Muslims cannot remotely afford to live under a Hindu majority India. Now, there's absolutely truth to that claim, seeing, what is happening in India right now. But I think one of the things that's very often glossed over when talking about partition is that the people that were making deals with the British, they came from the most elite of the subcontinent. So Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was the Qaid-e-Azam of Pakistan, the founder of Pakistan, he basically came from a wealthy Gujarati family, wealthy Gujarati upper caste family. He was not at all representative of the vast majority of Muslims who, if you look at, especially in India, for example, the vast majority of Muslims are actually from marginalized caste backgrounds, right? They come from marginalized caste, working class backgrounds that had way more in common with their, again, also marginalized caste and working class, quote unquote, Hindu backgrounds. Now, the concept of Hindu itself is already problematic to begin with, because this is going to shock a lot of your audience, but there was no concept of a unified Hinduism until the British came along. There was no such thing as a unified Hinduism until the British came along. What happened was a lot of the administrators under the British were members of the various Brahmin castes of India. And so the British, in order to streamline their administration of the subcontinent, what the Brahmins found an opportunity to basically establish their foothold within the British wealth extraction enterprise. And they basically went and told the British, saying, these shastras, these dharma shastras, the Manusmriti, and all these different religious texts that we wrote, those are called Hindu law, right? Now, before this, Hindu was a geographic term. Hindu / India, it's the same word effectively, right? It just meant anyone that was on the opposite side of the Sindh River, right? That's where it comes from. It comes from Sindh, actually. That's where the word India comes from, right? So it's the Persian name for India, right? So these Brahmins that were basically overrepresented in the British population, they're like 2, 3, 4, 5% of the population as a whole. They basically ran the show under the British, right? They were the ones that came to the British and said, we're all Hindus. Anyone that's not Muslim, that's not Christian, we're all Hindus, right? So basically, and there's a YouTube channel called India Inc. that does a really good job explaining this. Basically, they went to the British and said, this is Hindu law. Everyone that's not Christian or Muslim is automatically considered Hindu. Which basically, if you know anything about India, so the biggest mistake a lot of people have about India is that there's 4 castes. So Brahmin, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras. The actual truth is there aren't 4 castes. There are roughly 5,000, right? There are roughly 5,000 castes, actually. And there's even subcastes within those castes, right? So Brahmins are basically saying we're the spokespeople for all of these different people with different religious practices because we wrote the religious texts, right? So that ties back into partition in that this concept of Hindu was already a tenuous thing to begin with. It's a colonial fabrication that was specifically made to make British administration of the subcontinent much easier, right? But the people that were representing the so-called Indian side, they almost entirely came from the upper caste of India. Pandit Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, he's a Kashmiri Pandit. He's a Kashmiri Brahmin, right? He's a Kashmiri Brahmin. So that's the background he has. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who's sympathetic to the Hindu Mahasabha, who was basically like this group that was trying to, a Hindu revivalist, like proto-Hindu nationalist organization. Patel, he's a Patidar caste, right? Upper caste Gujarati, right? And there was this counter strain to the Muslim League called the Momin Conference that wanted to basically say, hey, the Muslim League doesn't represent your average working class Muslims. We do. We're the vast majority of the working class Muslims, right? And he actually originally went to Nehru and said, hey, like he went to Nehru and he basically said, hey, listen, these guys don't represent us. And Nehru basically agreed with Abdul Qayyum Ansari, who was the leader of that movement. But he basically said, we have to let partition happen because raising this issue among giving you guys, the Momin Conference, the working class Muslims of that time, any sort of credence would set the precedent for Dalits, who are oppressed caste among the Hindu ranks, Dalits and Adivasis and OBCs, the middle and oppressed caste of the Hindus. That would give them, a green light to basically say, hey, wait, these guys don't the Congress Party doesn't represent all of us either. So it would actually shine light on the caste antagonisms that existed in the subcontinent at the time, right? Which was basically being buried through the.
Yeah, there's two things I'll just underline that I was ignorant of that you said there. Both the Hindu as a sort of political creation developed historically, and also that caste itself extends far beyond, say, just what we understand as Hindu in the subcontinent.
Yeah, every religion in the subcontinent practices caste to some degree. So this is going to be a shock to everyone, but it's not it's the worst when it comes to, Hindus, because that's where that's where the whole concept comes from, right? It comes from that. You can't even call it a religion. It's basically like a collection of, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar literally said that Hinduism is nothing but a collection of castes, right? That's all it is at its very core.
You're right. And so to see it so active today as kind of a fairly direct result of Britain's sort of entanglement is pretty stunning.
So the Hindu nationalist movement didn't necessarily happen directly because of the British, right? I wouldn't say that.
Yeah.
But I would generally say that the Hindu nationalists of that time, like V.D. Savarkar, who was the godfather of Hindu, what most people know as Hindutwa. V.D. Savarkar was very loyal to the British. He was jailed in a place called Kalapani in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, it's actually closer to Malaysia, actually, but it's a territory of India. He was jailed there, and while he was jailed, he was writing letters of petition to the British, basically saying, hey, we will, we Hindu nationalists, we Hindutwadis, or, all of us, we will do whatever you want. We can only but serve Her Majesty. I'm paraphrasing the petition, the mercy petition that he wrote. But he basically said, we can only but serve Her Majesty's best interests. Right. And so I wouldn't say that the British created Hindu nationalism. I don't think it's fair to say that. But it's very obvious that Hindu nationalists wanted to basically establish a Hindu ethno-state, what they call a Hindu Rashtra, Hindu state, under the British, and through any means necessary. And if that meant collaborating with the British, then so be it. Right. So the most loyal bootlickers of the British, the most loyal colonial bootlickers were these Hindu nationalists.
And, the move that's sort of been marked broadly in India is a move away from sort of secular governance toward Hindutva. What would you sort of peg that to as the main drivers?
Hindutva is just like all forms of nationalism, Hindutva or Hindu nationalism is the fascist response to growing class or caste consciousness in this case, right? So if fascism in America is a right-wing reaction to the contradictions of the working class of class antagonisms in the United States, right? Fascism is the right-wing response to that, or white supremacy, white nationalism is, right? A Christian nationalism is the right-wing response to that. In India, the Hindutva has always been a club run by Brahmins. Even the current leader of the RSS, Mohan Bhagwat, he's a Brahmin himself, right? So it's always been led by Brahmins. It has always instilled a caste hierarchy within the ranks of the RSS. Right. But I'll give you a great example of this. So in the 1990s, a guy called B.P. Mandal opened an investigation into the status of what we now call the otherwise backwards classes. So these are castes in India that are not facing the biggest brunt of untouchability, like Dalits and Dalit castes and Adivasis, who are indigenous peoples of India, right? But they have been denied access to education over the years because of their caste status. They're economically not as well off as the upper castes. So BP Mandal basically opened a commission, and he basically, because of his commission, this established the otherwise backwards classes as part of India's affirmative action system, right? So this is OBCs are the middle castes of India, right? So that era of Indian politics is called Mandal politics, when there is a huge growth of caste consciousness, right? And caste consciousness is the only antidote to Hindutva, right? So the reaction to that, to growing caste consciousness, was the indirect reaction to that. There were protests that were saying, hey, BP Mandal Commission is wrong and all of this stuff, right? But the real reaction to the Mandal Commission was the burning down of the Babri Mosque in Ayodhya, in what was then called Faizabad. Now it's called Ayodhya. Because what that was is that movement, basically, the Hindutva movement basically said, no, your real priorities are getting the Muslims, are taking back this, destroying this mosque and establishing a Hindu temple on top of it, because this is the birth of Ram, of Lord Rama, right? So that is the actual reaction to growing caste consciousness so Hindutva has always been basically a way of downplaying and burying the caste antagonisms of India. That's what it's always been. It has always been a way for Brahmins who run the entire show to basically say, no, you Yadavs, you Jats, and you Vanyars or whatever, right? You OBC castes, right? Get in line, attack the Muslims and the Christians, do your job, and so that's what Hindutva has always been. It's been a way to bury those caste antagonisms.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Mandal Commission. That reminds me of this, the caste census. What's the relevance of a caste census in India?
So India conducts a census, right? It's like every 10 years or something, right? And basically, so as part of that, they ask for caste information. Now, what that reveals is it reveals the association of wealth and land ownership with caste. And it gives us a better idea of representation in politics. It gives us a better idea of representation in education, in government jobs, as well as land ownership. And the reason that's super relevant is that what that does is it actually shows who actually owns the majority of the land, who actually is overrepresented in politics, who is overrepresented in the in the government, who's overrepresented in education. It's that information that kind of exposes this unified Hindu identity. It's the caste census that basically says, wait a minute, you guys are not all the same, right? Some of you have a lot more than you should, aka the upper caste and Brahmins especially. You have a lot more than you should, right? You have way more representation than you should, because you're considering you're 5% of the population, and you represent at least over half of the main anchors on mainstream media, right? And you represent, I think, the majority of faculty at the at the major, most prestigious institutions, the IITs, IIMs, IASCs, so on and so forth. So what the caste census does is it actually gives us a correlation. It gives us a visual correlation, a statistical correlation between your caste position and your capital position. That's what that does. So the reason it's relevant in Indian politics is it gives people an idea of who actually owns what, basically.
Which is a scary thing to make too plain in certain parts of history.
I mean, the thing is, like, this is Hindutva's worst nightmare. It's that a real caste census is actually created. It's actually investigated thoroughly. There's no subterfuge done by Brahminical or Hindutva interests, right? That's their biggest nightmare. Because what that does is it actually enables the foot soldiers of Hindutwa to basically say, wait a minute, you guys promised me X, Y, and Z if I did this for you. What the hell's going on there? Am I allowed to curse?
Of course, yep.
Yeah, okay, yeah. They can basically say, hey, you promised me all this, so what is going on here? So it creates that impetus for doubt within the cadres of the Hindutva movement. So that's why the caste census is a very scary thing for them. But again, caste census is not remotely enough, right? There's lots of different governmental measures, and there's lots of different things that need to happen in order to actually break down this movement entirely, right?
Right. And while we're on caste, we've kind of been focused on India, but you also talk about how caste is evident in Pakistan as well. Could you just how is that, especially under a military dictatorship, like what's the status of that?
So I'm going to be honest, I'm not an expert on caste in Pakistan. For that, you might have to go to someone called Amar Ali Jan, who is the leader of the Hakuk-e-Halq party in Pakistan. He has a much better idea of the lay of the land of Pakistan than I do, but I'll say what I understand of Pakistan's politics. So a lot of the class or caste antagonisms that existed in Pakistan, so it depends entirely on the society. So there are some ethnic groups in Pakistan that just don't have caste, period, to begin with. So Baloch people are a great example. Pashtuns are another great example of people that just don't have caste to begin with, right? They operate on a different societal structure entirely. Pashtuns operate on a more tribal structure. Baloch, a confederated tribal structure. Same thing with the Baloch and the Brahwis, operate on that sort of model as well. But if you're talking about Punjabis, if you're talking about Sindhis in Pakistan, then caste is very much apparent there. And it's actually evident in some of their last names. So you'll find Pakistanis, right, that profess to be Muslim and that will say that, we in Islam, we don't have caste or anything like that. And they'll have the last name Rajput. Rajput is a caste name, right? And that's a major, if you have Rajput as a last name, that's an indicator of your caste. Like that's how caste generally works in India. It's in your last name, right? So they have a caste name as part of their last name. Some Pakistanis are named Bhatt. Bhatt is a Brahmin surname, right? It's from the same root as Aryabhatta, the guy who invented zero, right? So like the Pakistanis do have caste, but it's a lot more buried now because of the nationalism that exists in Pakistan, the kind of nationalism that exists in Pakistan. But what's interesting in Pakistan is that some of the religious bigotry that exists in Pakistan, especially towards Hindus, right? The Hindus that are in Pakistan, a lot of them come from Dalit castes because they were unable to flee Pakistan during partition. So the most marginalized Hindus living in Pakistan, if you actually look to their history, they're actually from Dalit castes, right? They're from the most marginalized castes. They're the ones that face the highest levels of untouchability. Right. So in a sense, in some broader sense, right, some of the caste, bigotry that existed in Pakistan has now shifted into religious bigotry. And also, Pakistan is a deeply casteist society in that the first minister of law, this is when both Bangladesh and Pakistan were one country. The minister of law, I forgot his name. He's a Bengali Dalit person. I think his last name was like Mandal or something. He was the first law minister of Pakistan was a Bengali Dalit who ended up fleeing Pakistan to India because of the caste discrimination he faced from West Pakistani leaders, right? From the caste bigotry he faced because of West Pakistani leaders. So he fled to India because of that. So that's just a general idea of how caste works in Pakistan. There's also caste coalitions that appear during elections as well, which I'm not too educated on. But that's generally how that works. In Sri Lanka, that's a different story altogether. That's a very different story. But I'll just leave it at that.
Well, that's good. Actually, let's move to Sri Lanka now. You have the first part of a three-part series on your YouTube page. I'll link to Grief-Stricken Winds, the Tamil Struggle Buried by the World. You talk about the Tamil genocide. You also have a great talk with FD Signifier on this, definitely under emphasize the story.
Sure. Basically, so Sri Lanka, let's just talk about what Sri Lanka is first. Sri Lanka is a state that was established by the British and Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists after 1948, which, if you know anything about the Middle East, that date should sound very familiar to you. That year should sound very familiar to you. So this country was established in 1948. Now, the majority of the country belongs to, or the majority of the country is comprised of an ethnic group called the Sinhalese or the Sinhala. This is a majority Buddhist ethnic group. They speak an Indo-Aryan language that's actually related to Hindi and Urdu of northern India and Pakistan, right? So Sinhala is actually also a distant relative of European languages like English, Spanish, French, right? And that's important because that also kind of plays into Sinhalese Buddhist nationalist politics. So what happened was, after 1948, the first Prime Minister, Dias Senanayake, basically started colonizing the north and eastern portions of the island. Now, this has been majority Tamil, which is the ethnic group that I belong to. I'm not Elam Tamil. I'm from India, right? I'm originally from India. Tamils are an ethnic group native to India and the northern and eastern coast of the island of Sri Lanka or Ceylon, right? And they basically started establishing settlements, and they started taking landless Sinhalese peasants and plopping them in majority Tamil areas. And the reason they did this is basically, this country, Sri Lanka, is continued to be run by effectively Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists who think the entire island used to belong to them like 3,000 years ago, until the Tamils came, invaded their glorious Aryan civilization, Aryan as in the Hitlerian kind of Aryan, their quote unquote glorious Aryan civilization, and destroyed everything. So that's why, according to the Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists, they have to go and retake the entire island from the Tamils. The Tamils are enemy number one. So they start establishing settlements, and which is what I talk about in part one. And then ultimately, this one thing led to another. This led to ethnic pogroms against the Tamils that were state-sponsored. And then in 1983, what happened was war breaks out. And the Tamil militant groups, the biggest of which are the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, start fighting the Sri Lankan government. And this war lasts 26 years. And that's actually the subject of part two. It's this war that happens from 1983 to 2009, right? And 2009, what starts happening in January 2009 is the Sri Lankan government starts establishing no-fire zones or safe zones around hospitals and schools that were later converted into makeshift hospitals. So they started corralling Tamils into these safe zones, and the Sri Lankan government just started bombing them. Right? And this should sound very familiar to you guys. This should sound awfully familiar.
I was going to say, yeah.
This should sound very familiar. So the Tamil genocide is basically an ongoing process from 1948 onwards of basically trying to exterminate the Tamils, basically. They're trying to dispossess the Tamils of their land. Even just recently, roughly 3,000 to 4,000 acres of Tamil land was seized by Sinhalese Buddhist monks, right? This year, actually, right? This is not like, this happened in 2009, the war is over. It's not like that. Sinhalese settlers have been attacking, Tamil farmers and their cattle as recently as 2023. As recently as 2023, Sinhala settlers were literally sticking live grenades, in the food of the chattel, right? And so what happened was, when the chattel ate those, their food, the jaw of the cattle were blown off, right? The jaw of the chattel were blown off, right? So this is like, there's still mounting aggression against the Tamils by Sinhalese settlers, and there's still ongoing Sinhalese settlements in what is occupied Elam, right? Elam is the name of the occupied territory that the Sri Lankan government is trying to remove the Tamils of. They want to remove the Tamils from. So in part one, I talk about what led to the war In part 2, which releases on May 18th, this Sunday, I talk about basically it's the war from 1983 to 2009. And we talk about a lot of different subjects there because a lot happened in that war. And basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to put a timeline to that. And this is actually something that no one else has really done, if I'm going to be honest. This is, this is a subject that basically not a lot of people know about to begin with. And at most, you may have seen like Sri Lanka's Killing Fields, which is a documentary. It's not produced by Channel 4, but the folks published it on Channel 4, which is basically that last portion where Sri Lanka bombs Tamils. So my series, Grief-Stricken Winds, talks about Sri Lanka's ongoing genocide of the Tamils. And it presents basically evidence that this is a genocide. There's no question about it.
I think you make
what Sri Lanka's gotten up to.
You make a very strong case. So again, I'll have the first part linked and maybe the second part if it's out on Sunday by the time we get this up. And just one final question on that: who is sort of like the America behind Sri Lanka when it comes to this stuff? Is that a fair comparison?
Everyone, no. So the reason that I say this a lot. So first off, the thing to understand is that Sri Lanka basically gets its arms from everywhere. Everyone has supplied weapons to Sri Lanka. America, China, Iran, Israel, Russia, Ukraine, India, Pakistan, UK, Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Lithuania, like Australia. All of these different countries sold weapons to Sri Lanka, North Korea even, right? They've all sold weapons to Sri Lanka at some point. They've been involved to varying degrees. It depends on the country. They've been involved in Sri Lanka's settler colonial program, especially Mahaweli. They have directly given intelligence to the Sri Lankan government, and they've directly given training to the Sri Lankan, military police, special task force, whatever, right? So there's, 24 to maybe 36 countries that are complicit in this somehow. So one of the things that I say is you would think that basically the major parts of most of the world financing this genocide or directly being complicit in this genocide, you would think that would be bigger news. But that's actually precisely the reason it isn't. It's because in cases like Palestine, in cases like Kashmir, there are countries that want to opportunistically take advantage of the atrocities being committed. But by doing so, they actually volunteer themselves as a channel of information to basically get that information out. So Lebanon, Iran, and all these other countries, whatever their commitment to the Palestinian cause is, right, that enables them to actually act as conduits of information for Palestinians. Pakistan not really caring about Kashmiris in general, they still talk a big game about Kashmir, which enables Pakistan to be this conduit of information that's coming out of Indian-controlled Kashmir, right? But in Sri Lanka and in Elam, that cannot happen. That was never able to happen, right? So most people will never talk about this. They will never talk about this. Most, media will never talk about this because it's a very inconvenient thing to talk about. It messes with every country's capital interest in the island. And the reason, and by the way, the reason everyone's interested in this island in the first place, every government is interested in the island in the first place, is because it's in the middle of the Indian Ocean. It has a deep sea natural harbor, right? And so it's valuable real estate for military ships and merchant ships. So it's extremely valuable real estate for global trade and for the military, for militaries of every country. So that's why, this issue has been basically buried. It's because every country is involved in it. And so if everyone has a vested interest in it, then they're not going to want to rock the boat.
I mean, that's a really grim, but I think important lesson in foreign affairs is that this stuff is usually relevant to governments when it's useful in a sort of international pissing contest and not necessarily based on the principles that they say are animating them to take certain stands.
Right.
ArunAnnow, been very, very good talking to you, man. We'll have the links to your YouTube and Twitch streams. Anywhere else you want people to follow your work?
Twitter would be really good. So my Twitter is also available for everyone to, go and follow. So YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter.
Awesome. Thanks so much, man.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.